Utah.
As if in legislative session and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Rules and Administration be discharged from further consideration of S 4292 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, I've read the measure that is being attempted to be brought up by this motion. And I want to make one thing perfectly clear. It is already a federal crime for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Every member of the Senate should know that. In fact, any non-citizen convicted of even registering to vote could face up to 5 years in prison. And every single state has a law prohibiting non-citizens from voting in federal elections. And the consequences for non-citizens go beyond prison time. Claiming to be a U.S. citizen under penalty of perjury while registering to vote or while actually voting are deportable offenses. So it's already against the law with significant consequences for violations. And in fact, experts have found that voting by non-citizens is exceedingly rare. A study of the 2016 election, for example, found that non-citizen votes accounted for, let me get this right, 0.0001%. Doing the math, that's about 30 incidents of suspected, not even proven, suspected non-citizens voting out of 23.5 million votes cast. What does that tell us? It tells us that our current laws are working. Don't just take my word for it. The Cato Institute agrees. In November of 2020, the Cato Institute found that, quote, non-citizens don't illegally vote in detectable numbers, end quote. So colleagues, plain and simple, this bill is a solution in search of a problem. What it attempts to do is once again make it harder for eligible Americans to vote or to discourage people from voting, particularly American citizens who happen to be experiencing homelessness, for U.S. citizens of color, for U.S. citizens without driver's licenses. Do they have any less of a right to vote than any of us, or less of a claim to our country? I speak today, Mr. President, as both a former California Secretary of State as well as being a member of this body. And I've always believed that our democracy works best when as many eligible people participate. That's why I, along with several of our Democratic colleagues, introduced the Freedom to Vote Act. Now, the Freedom to Vote Act does not extend registration or voting rights to non-citizens. What does the Freedom to Vote Act do? It includes pro-voter policies for eligible Americans like early voting, vote by mail. Imagine that, making it easier for eligible U.S. citizens to exercise their franchise. That's the American way. Whereas this bill would only serve as yet another barrier to participation by imposing not just extremely burdensome, but unnecessary requirements on registering to vote. And so therefore, Mr. President, I object.
Heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, it's unfortunate that we didn't have the chance to pass this today. I would love to have passed it. The reason I'd have loved to have passed it is because it's my friend and distinguished colleague, the senator from California, has just noted it's illegal for a non-citizen to vote. And because it's illegal for a non-citizen to vote, we need to make sure that it doesn't happen. The fact that it's prohibited by a law with federal criminal penalties attached to it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, doesn't mean that it's not more likely to happen when we bring a whole lot more non-citizens into the country. There are now an estimated 30 million or so non-citizens inside the United States. Now, my friend and colleague from California cites a couple of studies. One of those studies is from the Cato Institute from 2020. This was about 12 million non-citizens ago. Under this administration, we've let in an additional 12 million or so non-citizens into the United States. That rapid of an influx can cause problems. He also cites another study from 2016. That 2016 study was probably 15 or 16 million non-citizens ago. Things do change. Now, the Cato study, the one from 2020 that he mentioned, says that there's no evidence that non-citizens are voting in detectable numbers. It doesn't mean it's not happening. It may mean that they're difficult to detect. But the more non-citizens we have, and the more time that elapses when the National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA, remains intact, the more predictable, foreseeable, and indeed likely it becomes that many people, some of them perhaps maliciously, knowingly, intending to violate the law, others who might be in sort of a gray area, not quite realizing what they're doing or the fact that it's illegal, might end up registering to vote. Let's remember, in 1993, Congress passed the so-called motor voter law, the National Voter Registration Act. Made it very easy to register to vote in federal elections. All you have to do is check a box and sign your name. It's all on the honor system. If you do that, you're registered to vote. Now, fast forward 2 decades, the Supreme Court of the United States decides a case interpreting the National Voter Registration Act as prohibiting the states, preempting the field in such a way that states may not request any proof, any evidence of citizenship when registering someone to vote such that they would be eligible to cast a vote in a federal election. So, meanwhile, we've got a change in trend. Decades ago, when the NVRA was passed, number one, we had far fewer illegal aliens in the country. We also, number two, had a lot of states that wouldn't issue a driver's license or were reluctant to do so to someone who was illegally in the United States. It's now the case that at least 19 states issue driver's licenses to individuals who are unlawfully, illegally in the United States. All 50 states plus the District of Columbia issue driver's licenses to non-citizens generally. What that means is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 million people, or at least the adult segment, that portion of the nearly 30 million people who are non-citizens inside the United States today, all they've got to do is go get a driver's license, which most of them, if they have any interaction with other members of society, are likely to do, to go get a driver's license. You need a driver's license for all kinds of things. Once they do that, if they check that box and sign their name, all in the honor system, they'll be registered to vote. Not only does the state not necessarily know that they're non-citizens and ineligible to vote, the state is legally constrained, legally prohibited from asking for any evidence establishing whether or not they're citizens. So this really is concerning. We shouldn't treat it lightly. And the fact that it is difficult to detect makes it more important, not less, to require evidence supporting citizenship. Look, we have to do this in other contexts. Anyone who travels abroad or might at some point in the future travel abroad will have to apply for a U.S. passport. To do that, you're going to have to produce some sort of evidence of U.S. citizenship. When you start a new job in the United States, you have to fill out an I-9 form. Under the I-9 form, If you're a non-citizen, you have to produce evidence of your visa and your eligibility under your visa program to work. But if you are not here on a visa and you're an American, then you have to produce evidence that you are, in fact, a citizen of the United States. So if you have to produce that stuff to get a passport, if you have to produce that stuff whenever you start a new job, why would it not make sense to require proof of citizenship upon registering to vote in a federal election? How else are we supposed to protect our elections, our sacred elections within our constitutional republic, from foreign interference? Look, Mr. President, one person, one vote. One citizen, one vote. This is how it's supposed to work. This is a foundational principle. And it's under an unprecedented threat today. And it's under threat specifically because President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have refused willfully to enforce the law. And now we face a direct threat to our electoral system as a result. Consider this. Since President Biden's inauguration, over 9.5 million undocumented immigrants have entered the United States illegally and have been observed. An estimated 12 million or so have come in. That includes the people estimated to have entered without being observed. This figure exceeds the populations of 36 U.S. states, creating a crisis that's been met with just troubling silence and inaction from many across the aisle. With millions of unauthorized entrants onto U.S. soil, the potential for election fraud through ineligible voting is not just a hypothetical risk, it's a looming reality. Instead of urging the President of the United States to address this crisis, Democrats seem to prefer to resurrect the so-called Orwellian-named Border Security Act, a bill that has already failed in this body and will do nothing to mitigate the border issues at hand, the border issues created and then exacerbated by this administration. With the influx of non-citizens under this administration, even if just a fraction, let's say 1 in 100, were to vote, this could translate to hundreds of thousands of votes. Enough certainly to sway your tightly contested elections and potentially alter the outcomes, even in something as significant and with nationwide implications as far-reaching as a presidential election. This is concerning, considering that a recent study found that non-citizens have ample openings to illegally vote. Somewhere from between 10% and 27% of non-citizens are registered to vote, and somewhere between 5% and 13% of non-citizens vote in federal elections, including presidential elections. Across the nation, instances abound where states have inadvertently facilitated the crisis. I say inadvertently, but in some ways their hands are tied. Inadvertently here sort of refers to the fact that they don't necessarily mean to. It's that they're prohibited from asking for proof of citizenship. From unsolicited voter registration forms mailed to non-citizens to driver's licenses issued without adequate checks, practices relying merely on the honesty of non-citizens, including illegal aliens, have opened the floodgates to voter fraud. And while it's true that it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, there really are no effective systems in place to verify the citizenship of voters. A mere check on a box is all it takes, with little risk, very little risk of being caught due to inadequate state election infrastructure. Federal law even prevents states from requiring proof of citizenship when registering voters via federal forms. An increasing number of localities permit non-citizens to vote in local elections, further blurring the distinctions meant to protect the integrity of our elections. Prominent Democrats have openly discussed these tactics as not just existing elements, but as things that are beneficial to their agenda. Only months ago, every Senate Democrat voted to count illegal aliens in the census to help them shore up more seats in Congress and more electoral votes in the Electoral College. This cannot continue. It's our responsibility, it's our moral imperative to close these gates. My bill, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, also known as the SAVE Act, would be a vital step in securing the electoral process, ensuring that every state, in every state, every vote cast is legitimate and every voter is duly registered. The SAVE Act proposes amending the National Voter Registration Act to enable states to require proof of citizenship when registering voters for purposes of federal elections. Under the SAVE Act, we mandate that states obtain concrete documentary proof of citizenship at the time of voter registration. It specifies acceptable documentation that really is desperately needed. It's far more injurious. If you want to compare the two, if you want to talk about the amount of burdensome paperwork that goes on relative to what it is that needs protecting, I think it's at least as harmful, if not far more so, to fail to require documentation and proof of citizenship in the context of voting in a federal election than it is when completing an I-9, which everyone has to do when they start a new job, citizen and non-citizen alike. Furthermore, the SAVE Act compels states to proactively remove non-citizens from voter rolls and introduces federal penalties for those who intentionally register non-citizens. This bill echoes the sentiments of the American people from coast to coast. It transcends political affiliations and speaks directly to the core of what makes our country great: fair, free, and secure elections. This is about preserving the integrity of our elections and ensuring that each state have the opportunity to participate in a way that involves each vote being cast to reflect the American will. And if this administration insists upon keeping America's borders open, then the administration must also ensure that none of these illegal immigrants are thwarting our free and fair elections. Look, this border crisis, make no mistake, was deliberately engineered and has been willfully perpetuated by this administration. Now, they shouldn't want open borders. There are a lot of bad reasons, a lot of good reasons why this is a bad idea, a lot of reasons why we shouldn't allow this. And a lot of people like Lake and Riley who have lost their lives or otherwise endured heartache, trauma, and devastating consequences because of people who should not be here to begin with. But if this is what they want, then for the love of all that is sacred and holy, please, they should at a minimum have the decency to their fellow Americans to make sure that those same people who they've willfully allowed to enter our country against our law and against the will of the American people to at least not be able to vote in our elections because they're not citizens. Every day we delay the foundation of our electoral processes erodes a little more. We can't wait for this administration to enforce the law because this administration isn't enforcing the law. By passing the SAVE Act, we send a clear message that in the United States, voting is not just a right and a privilege of citizenship, but it's also a protected and a cherished one that our own government won't deliberately allow to be diluted and made less meaningful. As debates about election integrity rage, the SAVE Act stands out by guaranteeing that only American citizens will have a say in our elections, and thereby keeping those elections free from foreign interference, something we all care about. American elections must be decided by American voters. Full stop.